What's good, everyone? Hope y'all are having a wonderful day. Hey, like I mentioned, I'm gonna start making double the content, or that long form content that you see every single week. So we got a YouTube style video and a podcast style video coming every single week for y'all, along with the awesome content my videographer Mariah makes. I'm gonna be uploading my own stuff here. So this is that first non-interview podcast style video that I was talking about. This podcast is actually going to be kind of about a blog post that I wrote about obesity. It's a 3-part series kind of going over a modern approach on how I view it and how the research seems to be explaining what obesity is, what are some of the causes of it, how do we assess it, and then ultimately what can treatment look like over time, and in terms of what are some of the modern tools that we have at our disposal. So I'm gonna put a link in the description for the actual blog post itself. That way y'all can check it out, read it along while you kind of listen to this, because that's where I'm gonna have all my references, all the information I'm talking about today's video. So without further ado, let's just jump right into it. So as always, I like to get my definitions down first. We gotta know exactly what we're talking about here. And so let's go over what exactly obesity is. So if you're a health professional or a medical professional, or even just someone in the general public, most people have a general understanding of what obesity is. You generally hear it's a kind of an excess amount of adiposity, where physical activity is quite low or non-existent, and your caloric intake is quite high. So you have kind of this positive energy balance where, hey, I'm just taking in more than I'm actually burning, which leads to excess fat accumulation over time. And while that is true, and that kind of is the baseline understanding of obesity, I don't think that really takes the definition far enough, because I think more so that addresses some of the side effects or the results of another behavior or another disease process that is going on. And so what I really like to use is this definition provided by the Obesity Medicine Association. This is a medical body that kind of looks at various ways of combating obesity, diagnosing it, etc. And I thought they came up with a really cool definition, and I've heard this in other circles as well, and the definition is as such. Obesity is a chronic, relapsing, multifactorial neurobehavioral disease wherein an increase in body fat promotes adipose tissue dysfunction and abnormal fat mass physical forces, resulting in adverse metabolic, biomechanical, and psychosocial health consequences. That was a mouthful. So let's kind of break that down. Multifactorial neurobehavioral disease. I really like that introduction because, again, when we think about obesity in kind of a general sense, we usually think about eating excess calories, lack of physical activity, excess adiposity. And again, while that's true, you always want to look at the cause of things, right? So what is causing the increase in intake of food, right? Where it's kind of creating this, again, positive energy balance where we're now acquiring more adiposity, which leads to subsequent disease and decreased quality of life. And so they're talking about it as a neurobehavioral disease, wherein something is going on where you're adopting behaviors, in most cases, not all, where it's actually causing you to increase your caloric intake more than you actually need for good health or just kind of sustaining your appetite. And so we're going to dive into that a little bit more as to why that may exactly happen. Like I mentioned in that last part there, right? Increased adiposity causing tissue dysfunction, which leads to mechanical stress, psychosocial factors, among other things. And so again, the adiposity itself, yes, is causing a lot of these symptoms and issues, but the adiposity is kind of a side effect of what's actually going on, which I like to classify as a neurobehavioral disorder. So we're gonna kind of dive into that a little bit further. Now we'll go over some quick obesity stats. So roughly, we wanna know how common it is in the United States and also globally, because as time's going on, this is becoming a global issue. So as of 2020, just under 42% of US adults had some form of obesity. And obesity here is measured by BMI, or having a BMI greater than 30%. Now, I know some of y'all might roll your eyes when you hear me say BMI, and I understand, but in the second part of this vlog series, we're gonna talk about assessing, and we're gonna do a deep dive in BMI. You might be a little bit surprised on my take on that, but let's just put a pin in that for right now. So BMI greater than 30, as of 2020, roughly 42% of the US population was considered having obesity. Now, on a positive spin, this is actually a slight decrease from a measure taken in 2018, which is at 42.4%. right? So 41.9, about 42 in 2020 versus 42.4. It is a little bit of a decrease, which is something to celebrate, but again, we still have a long way to go. My thought process as to why this may have happened, there could be some issues with maybe gathering data during COVID time and how things have changed, or just in general, we might have kind of seen like the tipping point or kind of the max capacity of how this disease process expresses itself in our population. And so I would imagine that the obesity rates could potentially go back up, but we may have kind of just seen the upper limit of what we're gonna, generally find in the population. We also know that it doesn't just affect adults, it also has an impact on children. What we see is that roughly 1 in 5 kids in the States also expresses some form of obesity. So while it is primarily affecting adults in a larger scale of the population, it is also impacting our children more and more as time goes on. And so what we're seeing also is that over time, it's no longer just an American or Western issue, it's becoming a global issue. We see that as of 2016, about 39% of the adults globally are experiencing some form of obesity. This shows that as the world is modernizing and we're getting greater access to food that is, highly palatable and calorie dense, it's no longer isolated to a few countries. It is something that's going to have to be addressed on a global scale. And at the current trajectory that we're going, it's estimated that by 2030, about 1 billion adults globally are going to be dealing with obesity. So again, it's no surprise if you ask the general public, especially health and fitness professionals, they understand that this is quite prevalent and it's something that we need to be concerned about. And so this data just helps kind of illustrate the extent of the problem, not just in the Western or American sense, but globally and how it's projected to go over time. Okay, so we got kind of a definition down. We understand, how prevalent it is. What are now some of those causes that lead to obesity? Well, I like to kind of put this into 4 main categories here. If you know me, I like to talk about the biopsychosocial model a lot because it is important for understanding health in the human body. And so I, of course, would be remiss to not mention some of those factors and how it plays a role here. Again, obesity is kind of looked at, and there is again truth to this as kind of that just pure calories in, calories out basis. I want to preface this by saying that is true. Outside of extremely rare circumstances, but even in, certain disease states, it is going to be a calories in, calories out equation. If you consume more than you burn, or that your body is able to burn, you have a positive energy balance, meaning that you're going to hold on to more energy, which eventually turns into adipose tissue, which over time chronically can lead to these health concerns we see associated with obesity. However, that is more so addressing a symptom rather than the cause. So while saying calories in, calories out leads to obesity is accurate, it's not very helpful, right? A kind of a thing that I like to say is, it's not a one-to-one, but people say, oh, if you're dealing with obesity, just eat less food. Yes, in theory, that is true, but that's like telling someone who is, dealing with a hardship financially, it's like, oh, if you're poor, just make more money. Obviously, if you want to get out of poverty, you have to make more money, but just saying that doesn't actually change anything. It doesn't provide any action items, doesn't explain the complexities of why people deal with poverty or what they're going to do to change their life for the better. And I view obesity in kind of a similar lens. So we're going to talk about how does this actually happen, as opposed to just saying calories in, calories out, which is kind of a period sentence that doesn't go anywhere. So first, we're going to talk about the biological factors. A big thing to think about is that for most of history for humans, we were struggling to find food. Our ancestors were having to catch prey or struggling to produce crops that were sustainable over time. And so we have a natural drive biologically to eat, right, to survive. And there's always the chance that, food may not always be as readily available as it is before. And so when the getting is good, you want to make sure that you are able to be hungry, have access to those calories and eat them and store them properly. So that way, in case there is a famine or you can't get food or whatever the case is, you are safe and your survival is taken care of. Now, that is a biological urge that we have, and that is great. However, in a modern world, we've kind of, in most circumstances, have gotten rid of a lot of those issues where you're not necessarily going to starve in certain parts of the world. And so the world and our technology has shifted so rapidly that our biology has not caught up. So even though we understand that, hey, I can go to the supermarket, which is a 15-20 minute walk for most of us, or a 5-minute drive, and get all the food I could ever want, while we understand that, our biology still is wired to say, hey, consume, 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 and eventually that can lead to some behaviors that are not the most beneficial for our health. There's also psychological factors that play into a role. This one's also kind of physiological because it involves hormones, but it goes to the neurobehavioral side of things, right? That blend of physiology and psychology. We know that for those individuals who start eating excess calories and then develop dependency on excess calories or feel-good effects from them, you start to have some issues with some hormone regulation, things like ghrelin and leptin, where these hormones that regulate how hungry or how full you feel start to have dysfunction. And so a lot of times for people dealing with obesity, at a certain point, they actually feel like they're really, really hungry, or the food that would normally fill them up before doesn't do so anymore. And so they have this urge and drive to consume and consume, which again leads to that positive energy balance. We also know that food can be kind of a coping mechanism for a lot of people that are dealing with stress, anxiety, depression, pain, other issues they may be having in their life, where food has that feel-good effect. And of course, we need it to survive, right? Sometimes having a nice meal after a long, stressful day is kind of the best part of your day. And so for some people who are dealing with these issues long-term, food may be that coping mechanism that kind of brings joy into their life to, for lack of a better term, self-medicate or combat these issues that they're dealing with. I think as we go into the future, we're gonna see more and more that obesity and kind of the neurobehavioral side of it has a lot of relationships to how we may view addiction or substance abuse disorder, where, again, we're looking at the side effect, right? For someone who may be addicted to heroin or maybe, addicted to pills, where, okay, we see that this individual is using, and that can obviously cause a lot of issues for their health. But the question goes into, why are they using? What is forming that, need to utilize the drug per se? And obviously it's not a one-to-one because again, you need food to survive. But I think the dependency factor that initially comes with food and the feeling that it gives you potentially to deal with certain things, again, like stress and anxiety, may have a relationship that is somewhat similar. So I am interested to see, how that plays out in the future, because I could see there being some similarities in that regard. There's also social and environmental factors that play a large role. Again, depending on where you are in the country or in the world, food may be not as readily available, or certain types of food may be easier to acquire than others. We understand there's things like food deserts and fast food joints that are more readily available than your local Whole Foods or Walmart or Publix. You may be difficult for you to get to certain areas, or maybe unsafe to travel far distances to get to certain shopping centers versus going to fast food and other places. And I want to be clear, I'm not demonizing fast food. Like, don't get me wrong. I love me some Chick-fil-A. I love Steak and Shake. All those places are great and you should enjoy them. But when that becomes the bulk of your diet, these hyper palatable, high calorie, sometimes low nutrient foods, they may not be good long-term because again, they may not make you feel as full as you otherwise would. The nutrient to calorie ratio isn't the best, where you're set up where you're like, hey, I'm gonna feel full, I'm gonna get the nutrients I need, I'm gonna feel satiated, versus, oh, that was really good, I could keep eating more and more and more. Kind of going back to the biological side, there's something when glucose, salt, and fat kind of come together. They're quantities or they're substances that your body really craves for survival. And so a lot of hyperpalatable foods tend to have a good mixture of those things. Think like soft drinks, soda, think fast food, like, high fat, high carbohydrate food that can really taste good and have those nutrients that your body craves, but it doesn't have other high nutrient dense properties like high levels of protein and micronutrients like vitamins and minerals. And of course, in your environment, there's also, the people around you, right? A lot of times you are a product of your environment, and this isn't to get rid of responsibility on the individual part, which I always advocate for, but it's hard to teach someone who has grown up in an environment that maybe doesn't value certain things to then adopt these behaviors as an adult. For example, if you grow up in a household that doesn't really care about cooking well or exercise practices or how to shop and get good food at a cheap price, that can be something that is more difficult to adopt as an adult versus if someone, when you were a kid, you grew up in a home that actually valued those things and taught you those things, right? How to cook a good meal, how to shop on a budget, how to prep everything properly. That is very valuable skills that, if done at a young age, can carry over into adulthood and make that process or that transition a lot smoother than it otherwise would be. And of course, the last thing is physical activity. While physical activity isn't a one-to-one, and if I had to choose between just modifying diet and modifying exercise, if I had to pick one of those, I would pick modifying diet to help combat obesity. But physical activity is a part of the equation as well that should be implemented, and not just from the calorie maintenance side, but also just the physical health benefits that come with it. We know from ACSM that 24.2% of Americans self-report meeting the recommended physical activity guidelines. This is 150 minutes of moderate or 75 minutes of vigorous aerobic activity and twice a week resistance training where you're hitting each major muscle group. And so this is self-reported, meaning that although 24.2% of people say they need it, it's probably less because people tend to overestimate their exercise and underreport how much they eat. And so I'd argue it's probably closer to maybe around the 20% or even lower if we actually truly surveyed people or tracked people in how they work out. And again, looking at these four main factors, right? Your biology, your psychology, your social / your environmental factors, along with physical activity. These are things that you do your best to see if you can modify, right? We can't necessarily modify our biology right this very second, but how can we look to modify our environment, our physical activity, some of our psychological factors? What can we do to maybe modify those things to ultimately help improve the obesity process over time? And like I mentioned, I'm never going to say that, there's no responsibility or absolve responsibility. But what I like to say again is that obesity or having obesity yourself is not a choice, but your willingness to get better and to ultimately improve your health over time is something that is your choice. So that's something to think about, and that I try to instill in my trainers, but also when talking with my clients to, make sure, hey, this isn't a guilt trip here, right? This isn't a judgment of your character. It's something that we're working on together to ultimately just better your health. And again, you'll hear me always use the term having obesity, not saying someone is obese. Obesity is a disease. And so when we talk about that, we want to make sure that we're not calling someone a disease, right? You don't say that, someone is cancer. You say that someone has cancer, that they have a disease that they're dealing with. And so while obesity, yes, has a behavioral component to it, and I know that makes some people uncomfortable when talking about it, or they assume that it's 100% just pure willpower, I push back on that and say, yes, absolutely, individual responsibility for your health, but this is a disease process that they're dealing with. It's not a moral judgment on their part. We're just working to help them get better, help them make changes to their behavior to ultimately help them be healthier. Now let's talk about some of the risk factors associated with obesity. When we get to the assessment part in vlog number 2, I'm going to talk about ways we assess it and things like that, because there is actually kind of the other side of the spectrum, right? We have one side where it's like obesity is all your fault, you're a morally bad person if you have obesity, etc. Then there's the other side where people may say, obesity is not a problem at all, right? You having excess adiposity has no correlation with your health. And I want to be abundantly clear, that is not what I'm saying at all. Obesity does in fact lead to a lot of diseases across the body, or a lot of complications, and ultimately shortens your lifespan. And so we want to make sure that we understand what exactly happens. When people push back on me, think about like the health at every size situation, etc. I always like to use the example of a smoker. We all know universally that smoking is unhealthy for you, right? It can lead to various types of cancer and is very, very harmful for your lungs, your bones, your vascular system, etc. But there's always going to be that one person who says, well, my grandfather smoked since he was 20 years old and he lived to be 99, and he smoked every day his entire life, never had a problem. There are going to be people who participate in unhealthy habits that ultimately don't have any issues, right? Those are outliers though. When you participate in unhealthy behaviors, your chance or your likelihood of acquiring risk or developing disease over time goes up compared to someone who lives a healthier lifestyle or participates in healthier habits. Just like on the flip side, you can have someone who is super healthy, eats very well, exercises regularly, does all the right things, and for whatever reason, they develop lung cancer despite never smoking a cigarette in their life. So there's outliers on both sides. Just know that it's not a one-to-one where it's, oh, you develop obesity, you're automatically going to have disease issues. That's not what's happening here. But by having excess adipose tissue from these neurobehavioral conditions, you are more likely to deal with a lot of these things that we're going to talk about here. So it's no surprise here that the more common things that you're going to see with excess adiposity, especially over time, is going to be various forms of cardiovascular disease. You're going to see things like heart disease, heart attack, dyslipidemia, and stroke. You're also going to see various types of cancer that could accumulate, high blood pressure, issues with bone mineral density. There's going to be hormonal complications, development of type 2 diabetes, physiological and biomechanical issues, meaning greater stress on the body, more likely to experience pain and injury, poor quality of sleep, higher levels of stress and anxiety. Again, it's no surprise that obesity does lead to some health complications pretty much across your physiology and psychology. And lastly, what is kind of the reason why excess adipose tissue leads to these disease processes and ultimately a lower quality of life or a shorter life expectancy? Well, what seems to happen is by accumulating excess adipose tissue, especially in a way that isn't healthy, because we know that adipose tissue does a lot of great things for your body. It helps with, nervous system regulation, helps with energy utilization and storage. It does a lot of amazing things for your body. You need body fat. But when you have an excess amount of it, it can actually put your body into a chronic inflammatory state. Things where you can develop pro-thrombotic qualities in your body. And so certain things with your blood and your cardiovascular system are ultimately going to put you at greater risk for stroke, heart attack, all those things that we mentioned earlier. And so again, adipose tissue, when taken to an unhealthy extreme, kind of becomes almost like this prothrombotic secreting gland that can lead to issues later down the road. And that's it. I really hope y'all enjoyed this video. Again, this is going to be part 1 of a 3-part series going over the various processes of obesity. In the next one, I'm going to go over assessments. So how do we actually assess if someone is dealing with obesity? Going way into the background about BMI, waist circumference, all those things that you hear about in pop culture when it comes to obesity. And as always, if you enjoyed this video, please be sure to like, comment, share, and subscribe. We got daily content on Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube Shorts. And we got the merch out. Don't forget for y'all to cop some merch on theshiftmethod.org/store. And I look forward to making more content for y'all. Hope you have a wonderful day, and I'll see y'all in the next one. Later.